Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for taking time out to listen in, especially because I know a few of you have heard some of this before. So I'm gonna be talking today about sort of what we've learned in social science over the course of the past 10 years about the public and fire. And so I'm going to talk on 3 different topics. First, I'm going to talk about public understanding. There's a lot of conventional wisdom out there about what the public thinks and who the problem is. And I'm going to talk about what the reality is, what research tells us about some of those conventional wisdoms. And the short answer is very few of them are accurate. Then I'm going to briefly touch on some communication, what's been learned from communication. And that's more just to give an idea of what can be learned from other fields. And then I'll also briefly discuss specifically some of the defensible space decision making. So the first conventional wisdoms is information and patterns that apply whether or not we're talking about prescribed fire thinning or defensible space. And it's pulled from multiple studies. It's not just one study. It's not from one part of the country. These are stars from studies I've been involved in research sites up to 2006, but I'm pulling from times people say, well, it's different in my location, or that's going to be different over in the Southwest or something like that. And the patterns that we see that I'm going to talk about in this first part are pretty consistent across all these different sites and these different regions and the different ecosystems. Local context will always shape your results, but the basic general patterns seem to be pretty consistent. So the first conventional wisdom that you often hear is the risk. People don't understand the fire risk. If they just got the fire risk, then they would all have defensible space and they would all support prescribed fire and thinning. And studies show that actually they really do get the risk. There's very few places you go where people don't understand that they live in a fire hazard area. There will always be one or two, but that's just human nature. And the part of the thing about risk and why it's not an automatic that risk leads to what you want is that it's a really complicated and actually really subjective concept. And oftentimes we're talking about different risks. The classic definition of risk is probability times consequences. So how you calculate probability, what consequences you consider are all going to shape what risk you're talking about. Oftentimes there's a sense that there's a difference between the sort of more technical expert risk assessment and the lay assessment. For instance, in the fire world, risk is often talked about purely as probability and not about consequences. And so right there, you're already talking about something different. Then you might be considering different time frames. You might be considering different spatial extents. You might be considering different types of damage. So this is from one study where we did focus groups in these 5 locations. And it gives you an idea of sort of the different spatial extent, the different consequences, and how that affects risk rating. So in all of the focus groups, the moderator asked, so on a scale of 1 to 10, what would you say the area risk is? And as you can see, almost 8 in Hamilton, Montana, and in San Bernardino, getting towards 10. So very clearly saw the area risk as significant. But when you ask people about, well, what's the risk to your house, you get much lower risk ratings. And this is quite logical because it's a much more specific consequence than just a fire in the area, and it's a much smaller spatial extent. So it's actually quite reasonable for people to have a lower risk assessment for the house risk than the area risk. But if you just sort of asked about risk and you don't specify, you might be talking about different things. The other thing that's going into that house risk assessment is that people are taking into account actions they've taken. So a lot of people in those focus groups would say, well, now I'd say it's about a 4, but if you'd asked me 3 years ago, I would have said a 7 or 8, but I've done a lot of work. So those are other things that come into how people think about risk. And then how people respond to risk also shapes the whole risk perception reaction. So for instance, in those 3 focus groups, in those 5 locations, we had 3 focus groups in each location. And the design was to have one focus group of people who lived out in the woods in the interface, one of people who lived on the edge of town in the intermix, and then people who lived in town or in the middle of agricultural fields far from the fire, who were really unlikely to be directly impacted by the fire in terms of property loss. And what was really interesting is the people who lived in town actually had a higher risk perception for the area risk than the people who lived out was lower. So you'd sort of think the logical thing would be for them to see the risk as less. And when you looked at what they were saying, there were two dynamics going on. One was balancing benefits, and this is seen in a lot of other risk studies where the higher the perceived benefit of exposure to a risk, the lower the perceived risk. And so it's just kind of cognitive consistency. I really want to live out here. It's beautiful. It's peaceful. It's quiet. I have animals out my window. And so you make the risk manageable for you. And the other thing that was going on, which to me was even more interesting, was self-selection. So people who were risk-averse were choosing not to live in these high fire risk areas. As this woman in Flagstaff says, we didn't buy up there because I was terrified. And so what that kind of says is that sort of this idea that higher risk perception leads to action doesn't really take into account how people respond to risk. And so people who've moved out into the woods, they're tolerant of the risk. So higher risk perception doesn't necessarily lead to action. It's a necessary but not a sufficient condition. So you do have to see the risk to think about doing anything. But just seeing the risk in and of itself is not going to be enough to make people act. So the actual decision to mitigate, whether it's defensible space or supporting for prescribed burning, is going to depend on different factors, such as risk tolerance, your trade-offs with the benefit, and then individual capacity, particularly with defensible space, of do I have the time, the money, the physical ability to implement this. This is actually the first conventional wisdom I ever ran into, which is that Smokies taught the public to think all fire is bad. But I can point you to over a dozen surveys that show that 80% routinely see prescribed fire and thinning as appropriate management tools. So obviously, if they can see prescribed fire as an appropriate management tool, that right there says they don't think all fire is bad. And in a few studies that look more at wildland fire use, there's also room for that in certain contexts. So there's not evidence that they have an automatic fire is bad. And in surveys where they distinguish sort of different levels of support, it's about 30% give strong approval for both prescribed fire and thinning as absolutely great idea, go for it. And then 50% it's a more qualified approval of it depends on the situation. Do I trust the people who are doing it? Then there's a whole mess of demographic conventional wisdom. One of them is that it's all these new people who are moving into these areas and they don't understand fire and they don't do anything for fire mitigation. And there is really no evidence supporting that. And in some cases, actually, the evidence is stronger that it's the new people who are actually more proactive. Certainly in states outside of California, the Californians moving in bring with them their defensible space ordinances, or they're being used to it, and they're actually often the most proactive people. But part of the explanation for why new residents aren't clearly the problem is, one is in the United States, 60% of moves in the United States are within county moves. So those people might be new to that subdivision or that neighborhood, but they're not necessarily new to the area and to the fire risk. 20% are within state moves, and only 20% are out-of-state moves. So really, new people aren't inherently less exposed to the risk. And then the other dynamic going on is confirmation bias. And this is a dynamic that we all do, which is once we formed an opinion about something, we tend to give more credibility to information that reinforces that opinion, and we discount information that contradicts it. So people who've lived in an area for a long time, they've formed an opinion about land management, what's appropriate, what fire is, what the fire risk is, and they're going to be less receptive to information. Whereas new people know they're new to the area, they're more receptive to information, and they are more likely to act on it. And certainly in several studies, the people who've been more proactive were the newest residents. Similarly, the part-time residents are another group that we like to say they don't get it, fire risk, and they don't do anything. Again, there's no evidence that they're less likely to understand the fire risk than full-time residents. And there's the only evidence that they do less is because of time. I'm only here on the weekends. I'm only here for 2 months in the summer. I don't want to put up with smoke from prescribed burning. But it's not a given that the permanent residents will be more active. In this survey in Wisconsin, you can see that actually a higher proportion of seasonal residents indicated they'd done vegetation management on their property, And you can also see that time was really the one place where there was a big difference in terms of reasons why they hadn't acted. So part-time seasonal, it's not that they don't get it, it's basically time. And there's ways that one can work around that time. This is probably one of the most popular ones I went into. How do we get people to take responsibility for their property? This conception that people don't take responsibility. And so there really isn't strong evidence that people do not take responsibility for their property. This is from a recent survey in Ventura County, Alachua County, Florida, and the Helena area of Montana. About half put it mostly on the homeowners. And really, in Ventura County is where it's weighted more heavily towards firefighters. Ventura County has a very well-funded, very prominent urban county fire department, and it's probably reasonable for them to expect more protection. And I should note that this question is a little bit amorphous. We don't distinguish between protection before a fire as in mitigation and protection during. But it is an indication that people don't automatically aren't taking responsibility. And in other studies, there's multiple studies where they do focus groups or interviews, and it's very clear that people see taking care of their property as their responsibility. I chose to live here. It's my job to take care of the property. It's not the government's job to help me to do anything. One of the dynamics is people do recognize that the risk is shared, so they are concerned about actions on adjacent properties. It might be their neighbors. It might be more often it's the public land near them that they're concerned hasn't done anything. With neighbors, oftentimes recognizing the risk doesn't lead to them saying, oh, well, I give up. It leads them to coordinate with their neighbors and get their neighbors to engage. So the recognition that the risk is shared, for some people that might make them sort of fatalistic, but for other people it makes them more proactive. But again, the sense that, no, I chose to live here. It's our job to protect ourselves. So what do they expect of the government? Well, basically, of government agencies, they should take care of their land. If you're going to ask me to do defensible space on mine, you better do it on yours. Education, help us understand the risk. But that's not that there is a risk. It's more detailed. It's tell me about the fire behavior. Where is it going to come from? What's it likely to do? How do I mitigate it? And again, it's not just the general mitigation. It's specifics and the why that mitigation makes it effective. And then help with disposing of larger scale obstacles in some cases, and that's generally vegetation. That is actually one of the biggest barriers to people, is just getting rid of the vegetation off their property. And when they have assistance with that, that's often all they need to undertake things. That experience is a consistent effect, that, oh, if only we have a fire, then everybody will suddenly be proactive. Again, research in fire and in other natural hazards shows that experience really has an inconsistent effect. For some people, absolutely, it's the trigger they need to suddenly go, aha, I need to do something. Other people, it has the exact opposite of, hey, that was big, mean, jumped a freeway, what's the point? There's nothing I can do that will make a difference. Or, hey, lightning doesn't strike twice. We're not going to have another fire here in the next 10 years while I'm living here. So it can actually cause people to be less proactive. Even Australia, where they had a Black Saturday fires, 173 people died. There's not any evidence that people are behaving that differently. What experience does do is it creates a window of about 3 to 6 months where fire becomes more salient to people. So it goes from being number 30 or 40 on their list of things to think about and maybe do something about to somewhere in the top 5. But over the course of 3 to 6 months, it'll slowly get bumped back down that list. So it is a window. The most effective way to take advantage of that window isn't to sort of wait for it. It's to have information out there beforehand so that when that window is open, people suddenly go, oh, yeah, that's what they were talking about. So it's not a way to wait, but it is a window. And then finally, there are really few clear geographic or demographic patterns. So there's no, people often want to think demographic patterns of income or education, that's how I'll map and know my community and what they think. And there's no evidence that any of those are consistently associated with a behavior or a belief. Some studies will find a significant relationship. Some will find the exact opposite. But the vast majority of studies actually find no significant relationships between demographic and any sort of beliefs or actions. And geographic, similarly, there's no indication that there's huge regional variation. There are local variation, but that's more of a very much of a local context history kind of thing. Okay, so what does shape public views? I've sort of taken away all these things that we think shapes public views. This is the closest one, that understanding equals acceptance. There's a strong link between knowledge and support for a treatment method. So the more people understand about and are familiar with the method, the more likely they are to support it. This is from one study in California, Florida, and Michigan. And in California, they had defensible space ordinances, hadn't done a lot of prescribed burning. Florida, lots and lots of prescribed burning, no defensible space ordinances. In Michigan, no defensible space ordinances, and reasonably frequent prescribed burning. And how that plays out in their answers, well, California, much higher percentage had removed vegetation. That makes sense. They're kind of required to. But they also had they were more likely to have a positive attitude about that ordinance because they were familiar with it. They knew what it meant, and they knew that it wasn't a huge burden. In Florida, which had the highest prescribed burning rates, they also had the most positive attitude towards it. Now, here's a place where you can kind of see the local context. So by this sort of the more experience they have, the more they'll accept it. You would expect Michigan to have a higher positive attitude than California. But in Michigan, the site that we looked at was on the Huron-Manistee, near where the Mac Lake fire had occurred. And that was a prescribed burn that escaped, killed a volunteer firefighter, and burnt down 44 houses, I think. And to them, that was fresh. And so to them, there was just no trust about prescribed burning. So that was a local historical context that did shape their response. The ecological benefits are particularly important in acceptance, particularly for prescribed fire. Understanding ecological benefits of prescribed fire decreases concern about a number of issues with prescribed burning, including smoke. But it is also relevant when we talk about thinning and defensible space. People are often more interested in the forest health, ecological health benefits of what they're doing than reducing the fire risk. This is from a study in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Michigan. And you can see that the most important consideration in forest management was really managing for healthy forests as opposed to reducing fire risk. And this is very common, that really people live out in the woods because they love nature. They want it to be beautiful. They want it to be healthy. It's a daily thing. It's a positive thing. So it makes sense that this is what people really care about. Whereas fire, well, it may or may not happen to them. It's not necessarily something you want to spend a lot of time thinking about, and it's definitely not why they're living out there. So it makes sense that it's less important to them. Of course, the question of what is a healthy forest comes up, but that's something that can be worked with in terms of education and demonstration and showing people pictures and that sort of thing. The other key variable is trust. Do we trust the people who are giving me the information? Do I trust the people who are implementing these practices? So in the California, Florida, and Michigan study, we added Missouri in subsequently. And trust was a significant predictor of approval in all 4 sites. And it's been found in other studies. In general, the trust that's really important is not agency trust. It's trust in those who are implementing a practice. And in one study, that was the key predictor of approval for prescribed burning and thinning, was did they trust the people who were implementing it? So basically, it sort of boils down to that if treatments are generally acceptable, if they're done by somebody who's knowledgeable, preferably locals familiar with the area. So knowledgeable is a key component of the trust. So if a practice is established, people have had a chance to get familiar with it, understand it, see it in action, and they trust those who are implementing it, acceptance will generally be high. And I like to reframe this to a thing about respect, which is that people are really willing to respect the expertise of the authorities, particularly people in fire, particularly firefighters, local fire department. Those are routinely the people that come out highest on trust and credibility. And they really respect that expertise. People are like, I don't need to tell you to do your job, but I do want my point of view and my desire to be informed and my concerns to be heard. and I want that to be respected. So it's a mutual respect. If they get that respect in terms of being heard, they are very willing to give that respect for the expertise. But if they don't feel like they're being heard or being respected, they feel no need to give that respect back. So I'll just touch on communication. There's a huge amount of information on how to change behavior and social norms. There's the field of social marketing, which is, how do you keep people from driving drunk? How do you get people to wear seat belts? How do we stop smoking? As you can imagine, there's a lot of research on that. There's also relevant research on natural hazards management and environmental ed. And two of the kind of key points that come out of that is you need to understand your audience. And that's a lot of what I've been talking about up to now, which is understanding who your audience is and what people really think and who is or is not the problem. So you have to have, in understanding your audience, you need to understand where there's preconceived notions, where people might be misinformed about what people care about. And you need to tailor information for people. So you need to avoid saying what they already know. Very fast way to turn people off. If you start talking about what they know, they will just stop listening. So if you're talking about fire risk and they get that there's a fire risk, they will tune you out. So it's more important to figure out what they care about. If they care about forest health, then that's what the conversation should be about. And then it also, understanding your audience, helps identify resource limitations. Oftentimes, the real barrier has nothing to do with knowledge. It has simply to do with resources. I can't get rid of my vegetation is often the really common one. And if that is overcome, then people can actually be very proactive. And the other thing that comes out of it is that we often think that communication is basically, if we give people information, they'll read it, they'll understand it, they'll see it my way, and they'll change their behavior. That's not, unfortunately, how it works. What providing information does, it increases awareness. Increasing awareness does not lead to behavior change. It's sort of along the same lines of risk perception. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition. So what kind of ways do you reach people that can lead to behavior change? There's a tendency to focus on mass media because, hey, it's cheap, relatively speaking. It reaches a lot of people. It's very effective for raising awareness levels, but it's not very good for changing behaviors. The one exception is brochures, which are an integral part of any program that's trying to change behaviors or norms. And what it is that brochures can provide the level of detail that people need when they decide to do something. So once they decide to do something, then they have a reference document by which they can go back and have their checklist and see exactly what they need to do. What does change behavior? It's interactive communication. It's talking to people. This is really the most effective way to change behavior and norms. It's particularly important for complex topics because it allows people to ask questions, to clarify, and that's a two-way street. People can clarify that I don't want to, if I don't want to cut down the tree my grandmother planted, is there any point in my doing defensible space? And in turn, the manager can clarify that that's not cutting down the tree is the big barrier. Well, no, you can keep your tree, but if you limit up and you do all this other stuff, then you should be all right. So it's really a two-way street. It allows for that interaction. It is particularly helpful with expert information sources. Again, there's a huge respect for people who work in fire, and that's where they really want their information to come from. And it's also important because it builds trust. It allows people to sort of identify, oh, these people do know what they're talking about. They do have good reasons for what they're doing. And I can understand where they're coming from. And that's key. I've a number of studies where I've done interviews. I've heard some variant of, they wanted to start doing prescribed fire here, and I hated the idea. It's smoky. It makes me nervous. But then I had several conversations with the local district ranger, and she told me why they were doing what they were doing, and I understand, and she's a good person, and I'm still a bit nervous about it, but I trust her, so I'm okay with it. So this is kind of a conceptual model to put all these pieces in place. In general, this is kind of the original model most people seem to operate from. If they get the fire risk, then they'll accept the fire and fuels management. But it's really, that's a very marginal link. The really key one is understanding, particularly the ecological benefits, shapes acceptance. Concerns about a practice can shape acceptance. With prescribed fire, concern about smoke, concern about escape, are associated with acceptance, but there's also a lot of evidence showing that as people understand certain characteristics, such as the ecological benefits, those concerns become less important to people. So the concerns do shape acceptance, but those in turn can be shaped by understanding. And the other key point is a lot of the concerns that are raised are not inherently a negative. So I often hear aesthetics being raised as an issue with defensible space. But I've met more homeowners where aesthetics is the reason why they did defensible space and not the other way around. So a lot of times the concern is as much of a pro and a reason for support as it is a detractor. Trust is the other key part of acceptance. Are the people giving the information credible? Are they competent? And in turn, the communication process shapes both trust and understanding, and particularly that it's interactive can shape both trust and how well people understand things. So I'll touch a bit on defensible space. I'm going to pull from one specific study, but these patterns are supported in other defensible space studies. This is from the study I referenced earlier in Ventura County, Alachua County, Florida, and the Helena area of Montana. This was done 2 years ago. And so we asked, what extent have you managed your vegetation to prepare for a wildfire? And as you can see, over half total have done a great deal. Florida was a little bit less active. I think their fire risk there is a little less prominent, and the level of fire risk is part of what shapes how active people are. And in Ventura, you can see people have done a great deal. Again, reflects their vegetation management ordinance. But what's worth noting is that this 58 a great deal, 31 somewhat, most studies show similar numbers for vegetation management. If it's not teased out, I expect when I look at a survey that I will have a response rate of around at least. And we asked them how important were different factors in their vegetation management decision. In terms of what's most important, how effective it will be, how much risk there is. And effectiveness is something that has been shown with other natural hazards and adjusting to them, that the more people see an action as effective in protecting and mitigating the risk, the more likely they are to do it. Now, the knowing how and the how much it costs are in green because the order of these stay the same when we talk about building structural features, except for the knowing how and cost flips in location. We also did where we did a analysis, statistical analysis, where we looked at how important one of these factors was and how much work they indicated they'd done on their property. And the first two, how effective it will be and how much risk there is, were significantly associated with how much work they'd done in all three locations. So the more they said it was a very important reason, the more work that they indicated they had done on their property. And then you can see other factors vary by location, knowing how in Montana, which was the most rural of the three locations we did. People were very much out in the woods on larger lots and would probably have been doing the work themselves, and more complex lots. So knowing how would have been probably less straightforward. Cost and time in Alachua County, that community was more heavily on retirees and less well-to-do. So I'm surprised actually physical ability didn't show up there. But we asked people, what extent have you made your house more fire resistant? And you can see the numbers are a little bit lower than they are for vegetation management. This makes sense to me for two reasons. The first is simply until maybe this past 5-8 years, we haven't emphasized the structural changes as much as we have the vegetation. I can show you brochures from the 1980s with the circle and the vegetation part, but I can't show you brochures about the structural elements until more recently. So lower numbers, but still, the majority of people have done something on their property. The other reason the numbers being lower doesn't surprise me is we asked people actually what they had done, and what's worth noting is the large percentage of some of these elements that already existed on their property when they bought it. And it's entirely possible when you ask people, how much work have you done? Well, if it was already existed, they may see themselves as not having done much work. So it's worth noting that 60% already had the right roofs. And then you can look and see that of people for whom it wasn't present, the majority have done that work since purchase. And what's useful to note here is that similar to fire risk and forest health being different reasons, people have defensible space characteristics on their structure that often have nothing to do, are put in place for reasons other than fire. And so that's a useful thing to notice, is that in some areas it may be worth figuring out what other reasons there are for why people might engage in this. In the Midwest, people often have really good defensible space for blowdown reasons. They're more concerned about wind damage than they are about fire damage. But it's a point about paying attention to what people care about. And then the other thing to note is that there is one area where there's a fairly large proportion who do not intend to do something. And this to me says these are areas where maybe people need a better sense for why they might want to do it. Because it's worth noting that on the really important one, roof, there's very few who don't plan to do it at all. And I think one of the reasons that these three variables, exterior walls, eaves boxed in, underside of decks, are not planned, I think one part is cost, but I think the other comes out in when we ask people about reasons. And again, you see how effective it is, and risk is the very important. Cost becomes more important, which makes sense. But when you look at the significant relationships, how effective and risk drop out for Ventura and Alachua County. I take this as, the way I interpret this is that we have not done as good a job in our education materials at explaining how the structural elements and changing them is effective in reducing risk. I think people can implicitly get that having less vegetation means I'm going to have a lot less flame, and they might get the embers, they may not. But they can sort of see how on their boxing their eaves or putting mesh over vents makes them safer. And so I think that's a result. Anybody of you know who Jack Cohen is, that's the explanation someone suggested to me for why Montana, how effective it is significant. As they said, if you know Jack and you live in Montana, you couldn't not know that it matters. Then you see cost is important in Ventura and Alachua County, which are both areas where odds are pretty high that people will be hiring somebody to do it for themselves, whereas knowing how and physical ability were more important in Montana. So this is kind of a conceptual model for defensible space. So it's the same. Other principles still fit in terms of understanding, trust, and information, but a few other things come into play. So first you have to recognize the risk. We give them information about risk, and then they consider taking action. And different variables come into play in terms of considering taking action. What's the level of my risk? Is it worth my time? What are the possible actions I could take? What's my risk tolerance aversion? What's my experience? How does that come into it? What are the norms of my community? And those in turn can all be shaped by trust in the information source and how I got the information. So if a fireman shows up on my doorstep and talks to me, odds are pretty higher that they're going to really consider about taking action. But once they decide to take action, that doesn't implicitly mean that they will act, because once they say, well, maybe I should do something, then a trade-off analysis comes into play, at which they look at a whole bunch of different factors to decide, is it worth this for me to do it? And so the key factors there, the perceived efficacy. If I'm going to invest my time and resources, what's my payoff? Do I have the time and resources to do it? How can I get rid of the vegetation? Competing values. Aesthetics might be competing. It might be the way you don't want it to look, but it can also be complementary. It looks better. Laws are actually one of the big competing values we have run into in terms of erosion control can often have a different requirement from fire mitigation. So there are often competing values that people are trying to negotiate between. As I mentioned earlier, adjacent property actions can be a pro or a con, and social norms similarly can be a pro or a con. And social norms are something that can be changed. There are communities where it's gone from a sense of privacy to a sense of safety. And the main norm is not, I need to be hiding from everybody, but I have an obligation to keep my community safe. Once that trade-off analysis comes into play, then it'll come out pro to do something, or no, it's not worth it. Or it may come out as, I'm going to do one thing. So that trade-off analysis is really one of the places where you have leverage, which is to help them add more points onto the doing something column. These are two documents from which some of this was drawn. The one on the left is pulled from social marketing, environmental ed, and natural hazards on how to communicate and what a good outreach program entails. And I think Tim has a copy of that. The other is short articles of results from a number of different studies, which would have some relevant information. That's best going to the web and just downloading whichever article most floats your boat. And I think that's it. So questions?
Thanks, Sarah. That was great. This is Susie Coker from the University of California Cooperative Extension, and I am glad to be here and field questions for Sarah. So if people have additional questions for her, please go ahead and type them in the chat box, and we'll try and get your questions answered. Okay, so starting off, we had a question from Chris Barth, and this was fairly early on when you were talking about the effects of experience and the preconceived idea that once there's a fire, everyone will do something. And I think Chris was asking for clarification about whether experience has a consistent or inconsistent effect. He thought that the slide said one thing, but you said something else. So could you just elaborate a little bit about the effect of experience and how consistent it is?
Yeah, and I'll have to go look at that slide and make sure it's not too misleading. But it should, at the very top, say there is no consistent evidence that, and then all the things below are what the conventional belief is. So down below, it does say that experience has a consistent effect. But it is that there is no consistent evidence that experience has a consistent effect. So it's different people will react differently to what the experience is. So sorry if that was confusing. I'll have to look at that slide again and make sure it's not.
So basically you're going back to the statement that a fire could happen in a community and many people will interpret it differently, and so the way they react to that, whether that makes them proactive, is inconsistent. Is that right?
Yeah. So some people, the fire will be, their reaction will be fatalistic. It jumped 8 lanes of a freeway. What difference can I make? And other people will be, yeah, oh my God, I have to do something. So it's very personal as to how people will respond to an event. And it can be very individual, but it also can be the community, and it can be dependent on all sorts of little different things that happen. So even one person, it depends on the event and how they will react to it. So yeah, it's a very inconsistent effect how experience.
I wonder if you could maybe expand on what strategies that leaves for defensible space councils or people trying to work with the public. I know some of us call ourselves ambulance chasers. We want to go out and talk to people right after the fire when there's a heightened awareness. But if the effect is inconsistent and some people will withdraw, is that a valid strategy? Is that something you would recommend?
Yeah, no, it is a valid strategy. It's because the one thing that is consistent is that it does open a window where it becomes more salient to people, so they'll pay more attention to it, so they'll be listening more. They won't just sort of go, yeah, and throw whatever it is in the trash or turn the channel. So going out after an event is very useful. The point about experience is that you can't make assumptions about it being a pro, that everybody's going to be responding with a, yes, what do I need to do? That other people might be being like, well, there's no point. So you need to be able to address those types of responses as well as the enthusiastic, what do I need to do responses. One of the things that I have seen some evidence for, which is that actually what I call indirect experience is more influential than direct experience. So when I've experienced a fire, I'll draw my conclusions and I might be fatalistic, but when I see a friend or a relative go through it and I hear their stories, I'm more likely to be like, I don't want that happening to me. And so there is some evidence that actually that indirect experience can be more influential than direct experience. And so there are ways that actually you can use fire events, not just in the community that's affected, but in nearby communities that have similar conditions to say, hey, look what happened over there. This could happen. So it's a way that you can make it more real to people.
That's a great idea. Okay, thanks for elaborating. I think that was really helpful. Next question we had from Destiny Amon. She said, could you talk a little bit more about the piece you mentioned under the communication section about not telling people what they already know because they tune out the message? So if people are already familiar with defensible space policies but not implementing them for whatever reason, is sending out that message continually going to cause it to back?
I don't think it like if it's just sending out the information as brochures and that sort of thing, I don't think it backfires. It does at least keep awareness. It keeps people paying attention, and you never know when somebody is going to have their aha moment. So one of the other points of the communication is that it should be an information stream. So it shouldn't be you wait until a week before fire season starts, and then as soon as fire season's over, you stop. It should be a continual year-round thing. So I think it's more, but I think the question is how do you try to make the materials fresh? And I think that's why the interactive approach is so key, is because it allows you to very quickly move beyond the, oh, you know about defensible space. Well, what's the real issue for you? Oh, you don't understand the embers thing. Well, let me talk to you about the embers thing. So I think that's the reason why the interactive is so key. I think part of our challenge with the materials is to try to figure out, okay, how do we make them fresh, and what's missing out of here? So at least from my perspective, one of the things that is missing from our materials that's being added in, particularly by people like Ed Smith, is that ember role and how embers catch, I often think that when we have the defensible space things, along with saying, 10 feet away, limb your trees up from 10 feet, there should be an explanation of, and this is important because it stops fire from climbing up into the crown. If you put putting screening over your vents, this is important because it stops embers from coming into your attic, which could start a fire from inside. So I think oftentimes it's that next level of explanation that we might want to consider adding in to make the brochures a bit more detailed. But that is a challenge of that fine line between making sure the information's out there and not getting people tired of it.
That is a challenge. Absolutely. Okay.
Yes, I always say I have the easy job.
Well, and on that vein, our next question was from Timothy Lang. How can we as WUI communities support continued social science research into this topic?
Wow, man after my own heart. I think if I had the answer to that question, I wouldn't worry about my funding. I think it's letting people know when you find something that's valuable, how that is valuable, and how it made a difference in what you're doing, and communicating that information to the powers that be, whomever they might be for you. But I think a lot of it is social science is a little bit less, I won't say less concrete than some of the biophysical sciences, but it's harder to demonstrate how it makes a difference. You can, change your water volume. Harder to do. So I think when you can let the powers that be who make funding decisions and that thing say, here is how the social science helped me. It made me rethink this or this or this, or as is often the case, it really validated what I was doing, and so I felt more confident about what I was doing and that sort of thing. So I think it's probably mostly just making sure that the people know how it has helped you do your job better, which hopefully it has.
And I think this is the kind of question that we could ask the people on the webinar if they have some ideas, that they could type them into the box as well.
I think that's a brilliant idea.
Yeah, and maybe they could give us some ideas of what kind of, if they've had value or if they've promoted the research themselves. We invite you to go ahead and write something down. And I see Destiny is saying you can write letters of support for graduate students doing these work or applying for grants, since Destiny is a graduate student. And I'm sure that would actually be quite helpful as well. So anyone else who wants to give some ideas about how that would work would be great. Let's go on to the next question then. So Margie Brown said, I've been watching a very successful social media campaign educating and encouraging people to take proactive measures to prepare for earthquakes. Is there any evidence that these social media campaigns can motivate actions regarding wildfire preparations?
Good question. Marjorie, I want to know about that campaign. So do at some point let me point me towards it. There hasn't been a lot of looking at social media with wildfire and how it works. The only place we've done some research is in terms of how people access information during wildfires. And in that case, the social media comes out as not very well used, less than 15% in every location, but more important is that it's also rates lowest in being seen as useful and trustworthy. So during fires, that makes sense to me because I think people recognize that, we don't know where this information comes from. I think there are ways that it could be used in a social media campaign, but I am not. I think some of the challenges are simply what agencies let people do with social media and don't do. But I definitely think that's an area we could leverage more, but I don't have an answer in terms of how to do it. Another place where I think Susie's suggestion of adding in comments would be good.
Well, and I can just share, I know the Living with Fire in Nevada program has a Facebook page, and they have been producing short videos where they interviewed people who survived the Laughlin fire and some of the other fires in the Reno area recently.
Nice.
A minute-and-a-half video about how their defensible space helped them. And it's a slick campaign. I'm sure Sonia, I see, is on the line as well. I'm not sure if they have any effectiveness data yet, but I know I've been sharing it, and I'd be happy to post a link to it at the end as well as one social media effort. And yes, if there are others out there, please go ahead and let us know about it in the chat box or send us some links. That would be great.
I think my comment is that I would just be careful about imbuing social media with too much of a magic bullet. One of the other points with the communication is information stream, have the information out there all the time, and use all the dissemination methods you can, because one person will pay attention to one thing and another will pay attention to another. And I think the same applies to social media, is that it potentially accesses a certain crowd that is not going to be paying attention through other things, and that is really great, and figuring out how to do it best is a good idea. But I also think that there will be a whole contingent of people for whom it is not the way to access them. So it's one way, and how to use it best is a good question mark, but we have to be careful about kind of getting too carried away of saying, ha, here's our answer.
That's kind of like the media and the Arab Spring.
Yeah. Yes, well, I was just listening to a thing this morning talking about how all the Mideast countries are now collecting all that data. So it works both ways.
Lon Anderson mentioned that CAL FIRE's been using a Facebook page with short videos to get their messages out to the public as well. So it does sound like there's, more and more of it going on. So it would be a ripe area for research.
Yeah, part of the challenge is simply that it hasn't been around long enough that you can test it very well.
Yeah, and Sonia, who works with the Living with Fire in Nevada program, said it's too early to tell how effective they've been with their testimonials, but they view them as another way of reaching people, another slice of the whole pie, like you said, one of the multiple methods.
Yep.
Let's see. Also, we had a comment back when we asked people how can we support social research in our WUI communities from Chris Barth. He says he's been working with Rocky Mountain Research Station for the past 7 years looking at public perception of wildfire risk in the Front Range and western slope of Colorado. And he would encourage practitioners, people working on the ground, to work with the scientists to poll their community to help build up the knowledge base of commonalities and differences based on their demographic practices and experiences.
Yep, absolutely.
So that's a great point. Sarah, how does one work with a researcher if you're a practitioner? Do you just wait for someone to call you, or
call them up?
Yeah,
no, I mean, I'm serious. Is one of the challenges with the researcher is you always want to use there's a preference. You don't want to be walking into a community that doesn't want your help. In other words, you don't want to impose your interests on the community. So having local context is really key to doing good research. And I can find some of my contacts through meetings and ideas like this, but I would also say that if anybody on the ground wants, thinks that they have a great research site, you should just call up a researcher. They will never, ever be, they may say that's not quite what I study, or you need to talk to this person, but I don't know any of us who wouldn't be delighted to get a call from somebody saying, hey, I have this problem, and I really think that we should be asking this question. I'm currently working with Orange County Fire Authority, who, said they called me up because somebody had met me somewhere and said, we're working on developing a survey for, where we're trying to understand this, this, and this, and can you help us? And so I've been working with them on designing their survey, and I'll help them with the analysis. And that, to me, is an ideal partnership. So I would say if you want it done, just call someone up, because the challenge of trying to identify those areas can be hard, particularly from Chicago.
Yeah. And I don't know if Tim is back on the phone with us yet or not, Tim Klein, but one of the goals of the California Fire Science Consortia and the consortia around the country are to bring implementers and people who are interested in fire science in their work closer together with researchers. So one of the things we're doing, obviously, is having webinar series. We also have a great website, and I believe there's still the Ask an Expert tab where you can just submit a question. If you had some question or were looking for someone to get involved in your community, I'm sure that Tim would find the right people who might be able to respond to your questions. So
yeah,
we ask you to rely on us as well, because we hope to fill that role.
Yep, that's another good route.
I couldn't have put it better myself, Susie. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. Okay, we had another question from Tim Lang. Recognizing that many publications are technical, are efforts underway to offer the data for the interested public readers? And I guess what he's saying is translate it to a less technical level.
You mean without 500 citations and talking about p-values? Yes. It depends on the scientist. So for me, that's something that's very important to me, is that the science is usable. So the GTR that I showed that's on the right was written more towards managers than it was towards scientists. So it focuses first on here's the key takeaway points, and then it talks about how we got to the key takeaway points, all the articles in there. And other projects I know that people have worked on have produced one-page summaries that are written much less technically than others. So it depends on the project, depends on the scientist, but yes, there are definitely efforts to try to do that. I think one of the challenges, again, is disseminating it, but the consortia are a good potential place to be doing that.
Yeah, and the California Fire Science Consortia has a series of research briefs that are being developed for different regions of California. And Tim, that makes me wonder, have any of our committees asked us to develop research briefs on social science publications? And if not, we need to make sure that we put that on our list of things that briefs get produced for.
I think one of the challenges is simply that because social science is not quite, it is always place-based at one level, but the findings aren't. In other words, like I wouldn't want to do a brief for just one region of California because it's not applicable. And I think kind of what happens in the process is it gets lost because people are very focused on their local area. And the social science is at its most powerful when it's consolidated. But yes, I think that would be a great idea.
Addressing barriers to using prescribed fire and fuel treatments in that region, so it's an interesting local example of social science. But it doesn't really fit that bill of broad science like you just mentioned, Sarah. But worthwhile still.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then in association with this question, actually, Chris Barth offered that the challenge is often met if you work with a practitioner. And he says the responsibility is transferred back to the practitioner. So I don't know if he means that they're writing less technical briefs or you're working closely with them. But I get from the message that, you know, if you work closely with people who are reading it, that you'll have better success.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
We're honing in on the hour, so I'm just going to switch over to the final slide, and we can keep going with question and answers. But if anyone needs to leave, that's fine. I notice we just have one more question from Clara, if you want to field that, Susie.
Oh, especially because it's Spain.
Yeah.
She says it's very different in Spain. Their houses don't burn, and a defensible space as we know it is not available because of the price of the land in many cases. After many efforts, regional governments and agencies have realized that owners are, owners are what?
They're not part of the problem. They're part of the solution.
She said, I think we're now on the understanding and acceptance time of fire-prone community owners. What's your opinion about related studies in European or Mediterranean areas?
That's an excellent question because I don't have an opinion. I don't know of any research that does similar work in Europe. My general sense, and I'm intrigued by what you say about that you've hit the understanding, accepting time on fire-prone communities. My general sense has been that in Europe, the social has not quite hit that moment of, oh yeah, we really need to pay attention and put resources into this part of the equation. That until recently, it's been a little bit more focus on finding the right technical solution. And I'd be very interested in knowing if that's a reasonable assessment. But as far as I know, I have not run into any comparable social research in Europe. The only things I've run into have been around policy and around mapping. So if there is comparable stuff, I would love to know about it.
Okay. Well, that takes us through our hour. I think everyone agrees that was very informative. Or, you know, maybe you don't. Anyway, we would like to hear what you think. I'm assuming you're going to say it was, but it would be great to see what you think. And then if you look down in the lower left-hand corner of your screen, you'll see the webinar evaluation survey. We would really appreciate if you take that. It'll be a very quick online survey, and that gives us great feedback that helps us with future webinars. You can also join the California Fire Science Consortium email list by clicking on that link. Our WUI resources and link page, and you can also get to the WUI webinar registration. As you can see, we have landscaping in the WUI coming up May 3rd, making buildings ignition resistant sometime in June, and then Firewise Communities USA on July 17th. So please do. What you have to do is you have to click on that and highlight it, and then go to Browse To in that bottom button. So if it doesn't immediately do what you're thinking, go ahead and highlight, click Browse To, and then it might just take you right to that web page. And if not, when you get out of this webinar and have your browser open, you should be able to see it there. So thank you to everyone for attending the webinar. Thank you to Sarah for spending time with us. I know I learned a lot, and I'd like to hear from you all. And we hope to have you on a future California Fire Science Consortium webinar. So we're going to stop the audio now. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for good question asking and everything, Susie.
Agreed. Very good discussion.
Yeah.
All right. Goodbye.